Hello guys, welcome back to our introduction to programming with Python series. So in this video, we're going to be looking at functions in Python. So we have looked at different data structures in the upcoming videos. We've looked at print statements. We have looked at different stuff about Python, like how to work with lists, how to work with tuples, dictionary sets, and all that. How to take user input, how to do type conversions. So it's time now we up our game a bit. So we're going to be looking at functions in Python. So what are functions basically in Python? So functions are just blocks of code, blocks of reusable code that we call that to execute a given action, right? So it only gets executed whenever it's called. So we have blocks of code that can be in our program, but they will never be executed unless we call them. Okay, so this might be confusing. Okay, how do you call a block of code? Now, don't worry about all that. We'll be covering them in Python in this video actually. So let's first of all look at the different types of functions we have in Python. So there are four different types of functions in Python. They are basically built-in functions, which we will take a look at. We have looked at some built-in functions already, but don't worry, I will explain to you. We're going to look at lambda functions, which are like anonymous functions from other programming languages. So if you're coming from a guy from Java, they're called anonymous functions. In Python, they're called lambda functions. Okay. We're also going to be going ahead and looking at user-defined functions and also recursive functions. So recursive functions, don't worry, recursive function is just a function that basically calls itself. And don't worry if you will cross that barrier whenever we reach there. Okay, so that's all I want us to, these are the four main functions in Python that we're going to be covering in this series, okay? Okay, so let me just jump into the coding section and I'm going to go ahead and create a new file, and this is going to be part 22, right? So I'm going to say part underscore 22.py. So part 22.py, so we're going to keep into the functions code. So I'm going to say functions in Python, just like that. So right, so I'll start with the built-in functions. Let me just go ahead and say built in I didn't built in has a hyphen, built-in functions. So built-in functions are just functions that Python already provides us with that you don't have to work to use. So for example, let me just go ahead and create a list, right? So I'm going to say from typing, I want to use typing, so I'm going to import a list. So I want to have list import. I'm going to say my underscore list is going to be a type of list. So type of list, and it's going to be equals to this passing some elements. So I'm going to say 2, 5, and then 7 and 9. So these are elements we have instead of our list, right? So we can go ahead and simply print out the list. So print and then print out, this is going to be my list, sorry, my underscore list. So let's print out my list, and let's go back and run the code again. So we say python 3, right? So let me get that right. So we say python 3, and it's going to be part and then 22.py. So if you run the code now, you can see we have printed out our list in Python. So that's basically how you can print out a list in Python. So that's it. So one thing you might notice is a print is actually an inbuilt function in Python. So basically you're just calling a function and passing in some arguments, right? And this argument happen to be what we want to print in this case, and it's just in this case it's just a list. So a print statement is actually a function in Python, right? So we'll look for now. It might not make sense to you, but don't worry, just hang around. We'll look closely at it into more into depth. We also have things like the max function. We have looked at in other tutorials, previous tutorials. We also have max, which returns to us the max of a given iterable, right? In this case, a list. So also max is also a function in Python, right? So print is a function, max is a function. We also have the mean. All of these are just built-in functions in Python. So for now, you might not be really understanding this, but don't worry, I'll cover this and it will make sense to you. So one thing I want you guys to do is to come back to this section once we cover fundamentals of functions in Python. Okay, that like the user defined function, that will make more clear sense to you. Okay, so once I have that done, for now just keep this as a side. If you once we do user defined function, which you're just going to do just now, you can come back to this section of the video and watch this inbuilt function in Python, and it will make a ton of sense to you. Okay, so we have the user defined functions in Python. So user defined functions in Python are just functions that the user define. Basically, we define and tell it what to do, right? For example, this max is a function, but we don't know what it does. We just know that it's going to return to us max of all these things, right? It's just like a declarative programming syntax. Okay, so now once I have that, I'm going to go ahead and see how you can define a function in Python. So define a function in Python, let's just keep a code. Just define function syntax in Python, right? So define a function in Python, you have the def keyword, right? Def for define, and then the name of the function. So you can say function underscore name. and then finally you pass in the parentheses and then colon and then and press enter. So make sure that you indent it, right? So you go and press tab to indent it, and in here you just say pass. So this is how you declare a function in Python. That's basically, so pass simply that says that you're not this function cannot be empty. You cannot leave it like let me just delete this. You cannot leave a function like this in Python. That's an error. You can do this in Python. You can see even the file is highlighted. So there's the pass keyword. Just simply tells Python that it should not execute this part. It basically just an empty function. That's basically it. So that's how you can have a function. And one thing you forget, the function can also take in a couple of parameters. So you can say parameters here. So the function can take in a couple of parameters. So this is just the building block of a function. So you have the def keyword, the name of the function, which is just like a variable name. You can use any name that you want, and then you have a parameter. This could be one or a list of parameters, and then finally we have what the function does whenever it's called. Okay, so just to make this more clear, I'm going to go ahead and create so once you have this done, let me just keep some comment here to even make this more descriptive. The body of the function, right, goes in here. So the body of the function goes in there. So once we have that, you also can have an optional return statement. So it can be optional return statement goes in here. So that's basically how we create a function in Python, right? So that's basically, don't worry about it if you don't understand it. We'll just start building slowly, and we'll build up on knowledge. So let's first start by building our knowledge by how to create an empty function in Python. So for example, if someone asks you create for you an empty function in Python, so you know how to do that. So empty function in Python. So how do you create an empty function in Python? Again, we use a def keyword, and then the function name, let's call this my func, and then parentheses, and then colon, and then press enter, which is going to indent it. And you can just go ahead and simply say pass. I told you that functions cannot just be empty, so you have to use the pass keyword just to tell that, hey, it's an empty function. So that's how you create an empty function in Python. And how do you call the function? And to call a function, let's just say calling a function in Python. So calling a function in Python is just by easy as saying the function name and then opening and closing parentheses. So just the opening and closing parentheses is what you call invoking the function or calling the function. So just say the name of the function and then opening and closing parentheses. That is when you are calling the function, or in other words, people say invoking the function. So that's how you invoke a function. So I've created an empty function and you're invoking that function. This function that simply is empty, so it does nothing. So if you run the code right now, we should see we should see nothing, right? So if I go ahead and just delete this, comment out this part of the code and go back and run this, you can see that the function, even though we are calling it, it does nothing because it's just an empty function. So how do we make that we add more functionality to this function? And we can do that in Python. Let's go ahead and create another function which you can call. So let's say that adding function body, right? So this is going to be adding a function body. So I'm going to have a function say underscore hello. So this function, what it's simply going to do is not going to take in any parameters. Like I said, you can pass in parameters to your function if you want, but in here you're not going to take any parameters. Okay, so what you're simply going to go ahead and do is say print, and then you're going to say hello world. So whenever this function is called, what it's simply going to do is execute whatever is under its body. In this case, it's just a print statement, right? So whenever I run the code, nothing will happen, even though we have a print statement here. As I told you, this function, this block of code, right, which is a function, only gets executed whenever it's called. So we didn't call this function, so it's not getting executed. So how do we call the function? The name of the function, right, and then opening and closing parentheses. So if there are any parameters, we pass in parameters, but for now we don't have any parameters, right? So you can see we don't have any parameters here. It's just empty. So once you go ahead and run this code, it's going to go ahead and call this function. You're calling the function right here. So once you call the function, it's going to go ahead and come to this part of the code, and it's going to go ahead and say okay, what's in the body of the code? The body of the function, which is just this print hello world statement, and it's going to execute that, and that's why we are getting hello world. Okay, that's basically what a function is. So a function is just a box of code that has some statement that you want it to do or to activate, but it's never going to do that or to execute that unless you call it, right? So you create a function, the function will do nothing, absolutely nothing, unless it's called. Okay, I hope that makes sense about functions in Python. So once we have that done, let's learn how you can take passing in arguments into our Python code, right? Accepting parameters. So this will be accepting parameters in Python functions. So how do you accept parameters in Python functions? So I'm going to go ahead and create a function. I'm going to say hello world. This is the same hello world function we have. So hello world function, and this function is going to take in MSG, and it's going to be of type str. So you can decide to use the type int if you want, or you can decide to leave it out. Okay, so I'm going to use type hint and I'm going to say str, and we discussed about type hints from the very day one of this series. So I hope by now you guys are comfortable with type hints. Again, you can use them or you can skip them. Okay, so we're going to accept whenever a person calls this function, you're going to expect the person to pass in a parameter called msg, and you're going to go ahead and simply print out msg. And msg, you can think of msg as just a message, right? So now let's go ahead and call this function. So to call the function, I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to call that function. So I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to have my opening and closing parentheses. So you can even see VS Code is telling you that you have to pass in msg, which is going to be of type string, and this function returns nothing because you don't have any return statement. We'll reach return statement when you get there. Okay, so how to pass in the value to it. So you say msg equals to, and you pass in, let's say, hello world. So whenever we call this function, msg is going to be passed in here and msg is going to replace here. So it's going to print msg, and msg says hello world. So whenever I call this function, we're passing it msg, which says hello world, and it's going to go ahead and print msg, which is hello world. So if you run the code, we should get hello world twice, right? Because we are calling this function right here, which is also printing hello world. So if I comment out this part, and you just get back one hello world. Yeah, good. So that's how we can work with the parameters in Python. So let me just go ahead and tell you one more thing. There's a difference between parameters and functions, parameters and arguments in Python. So when you're defining a function and you pass in this value right, they are called parameters. But when you are calling the function and you pass in those same parameters, they are called arguments, right? So you are calling the function, you're going to pass in arguments. When you're defining the function, they are called parameters. So the same thing, but they're basically called parameters when you're defining the function, and argument whenever you're calling the function. Okay, so one thing that you don't even need to have to pass in the name of that parameter that you want, or the name of the argument. You can just go ahead and say hello, and this hello world, and this basically is going to be the msg. So if you run the code again, we should get back the same output. Good. So that's basically it, how you can work with different parameters. So we have talked about the different parameters and arguments. So parameters are used when you're defining the function, and argument is passed in whenever you're calling the function itself. So this hello world in string, right? String hello world is an argument, right? But here the msg is a parameter. So I hope that makes clear sense, because a lot of programmers are always confusing these terms and always using the term interchangeably, but it's not the same thing. So I just want you guys to be clear on that. Another function you can also have, let's just do more practice. I'm just going to go ahead and have a function called def upper. I'm just going to call it uppercase, and this function is going to is going to take in a text, and it's going to be str, and it's going to go ahead and return to us the uppercase of this text. So it's going to say dot upper, right? So we talk about the string methods, you have the upper method. Okay, so if you haven't checked out that video on working with strings in Python, you can check out that video. So basically we're just taking a string and you're converting it to uppercase. So now we're going to call this function. So I'm going to say uppercase, and I'm going to go ahead and simply, you can see I have to pass in text, which is going to be of type str, and this function is going to return to me nothing because we don't have any return statement. We'll look at return statements just in a few. So once I'm going to go ahead and simply say let me just pass in all lowercase. I'm going to say hello world. So once I go back there and let's run the code, so you can see we get back hello world, but in all upper cases, right? So good. So this you can just comment this part out, and if you run the code, you should just get back hello world all in upper cases, right? All in upper cases. So that's how we can work with parameters and method and arguments in Python. So parameters are used when defining the function, arguments are used when calling the function. So it's basically the same thing, but the context in which is used is different and affects its name. Okay, so now we have looked at how we can work with parameters in Python. How do you write a function that accepts multiple parameters? Let's say that you have a function that's called addition, right? And it's going to accept two numbers, number 1 and number 2, and it's going to return to us the sum. It's going to print out the sum of those two numbers. So let's have the function add, and it's going to take in num1. Num1 is going to be of type float, and you're also going to take in num2, right? Num2 is going to be of type, again, float, right? So we have those two parameters. So this is going to return to us the sum of these two parameters. Let's print it out. So we're going to say print num1 plus num2. That's basically num2, right? So we have those two there. So I'm going to go ahead and simply call this function add, and I'm going to pass in 20 and let me say 20 and comma. So I say 20 comma, and then I pass in the other parameter. So you can see it's taking number 1, which is of type float, and num2, which is going to be of type float, right? So you can pass in 30.8. So if you add that to be 50.8, right? So you can see we get back the print statement there. So good. So let me just go ahead and not call this function. So if I run it again, you can see Let me just clear the terminal. This is going to be 2022, right? If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, good. So you can see we're getting back 52.8, which is going to be the sum of these two parameters that we passed in. So that's basically how you can pass in arguments in Python. Multiple arguments. So you can have multiple arguments as much as you want. You can just comma, add more, comma, and more. And if you're calling the function, you have to pass in those arguments and then say arguments are separated by a comma, right? So you can also go ahead and do, they're also called, you can you have the keyword, right? You can call keyword variables, keyword arguments. So you can pass in the keyword arguments. Let's say num1. You can explicitly say num1, and you can also say num2. So if I say num1 or here, you have also pass in a keyword argument here. So you have to say num2, right? So whenever you start using a keyword argument, then all the other arguments must be keyword arguments, right? So if you don't use keyword arguments, they're called positional arguments in Python, basically based on their position, right? The first argument is this num1, right? The first parameter. So passing the argument in position 1 will correspond to parameter 1. Position 2, position 2 argument to correspond to parameter 2 position, right? So that's basically this. So if without using the name of the parameters, they're called keyword positional arguments in Python. But if you're using the keyword, they're called keyword arguments in Python, right? So yeah, basically using the name of the parameters, they're called keyword arguments. If you're not using the name of the parameters, they're called positional arguments. So I hope that's clear on positional arguments and keyword arguments in Python. So good. Once we have that done, let's now look at return statements in Python. So I'm just going to go ahead and mute this. I'm going to go ahead and copy this function again, copy it, move down here, and once I reach down here, I'm going to have this. It's going to be called return statements in Python. So how do you have return statement in Python? So I'm just going to go ahead and paste this function again. So instead of now printing it out, you can just go ahead and simply say return, and it's going to go ahead and return it's going to add these two numbers, and it's going to return the result. So that's basically it. So we're going to go ahead and call the function again. So we're going to go ahead and call the function. We say 20 and 30.8, right? So that's going to be 50.8. So if I go ahead and run the code again, we get back no output. Why? The reason why is that we're not printing out anything, right? You're just calling this function, and this function is going to return to us something. So let's accept what it's going to return. So let's say this function is going to return to us something, and if I go ahead and can just hover on the function, you can see that this function takes in num1, which is of type float, num2 of type float, and returns to us a float, because if you add a float and a float is going to be float. If you add a float and an integer, it's going to be a float. So you can see that's the power of using type hints in Python. It gives you this easy documentation on how to do. So you're going to take in two floats, and it's going to add them and return to us a float at the end. So you have to accept this somewhere. You can also go ahead and just print it out, or you can go ahead and accept it. So let me just go ahead and accept it instead. So let's say result, and result is going to be of type float, because if you look at the documentation, you're going to get back a float, right? So you're going to get back a float statement. So the arrow and then float is what you're going to get back. So we're going to get back a result is going to be of type float after calling this function. So we're going to just go ahead and print out the result, just like that. So I can go back and run the code. Now you can get 50.8. So it's just going to call this function, pass in 20, and this one is going to go up here, add the 2, and then simply return the result of the summation of those two numbers. So that's how we can work with function and return statements in Python. We can also just go ahead and simply copy this and paste it here. So it's going to return the result, and you're just going to go ahead and print whatever it returns, and you get back 50.8 as well. So yeah, that's one way you can think of it. So once we have that done, let's go ahead and from this I'm reading this book called Python Tricks. I don't know if you guys read this book called Python Tricks. It's a book written by, I think I forgot the name of the author, but I think it's from Real Python. If you guys follow Real Python, it's just a website that teaches Python. They have really good stuff on there. So they have written this book on called Python Tricks. So from this book, let me just read for you a phrase from this book. So Python's functions are first class objects, meaning that we can assign them to variables. We can store them in data structures like a list, a tuple. We can pass them as arguments to other function, and even return them as values from other functions. So I want us to cover the concept of functions being first class objects in Python, meaning that you can store a function as a variable, right? You can store a function in a data structure. You can return a function from another function, and also you can pass functions as arguments into other functions. Okay, good. So let me just explain to you. We'll go one by one, covering all the concepts. So let's start the first one. The first one is going to be pass pass function, pass first as a function as argument to another function. So passing function as argument to another function. A good example is just what you have done here so far. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it here. So basically, I told you a print is a function in Python, right? An inbuilt function in Python. So it is this inbuilt function we're passing in another function, which is our user-defined function that we defined ourselves, called the addition function, right? So we're passing the addition function into an inbuilt function in Python. So what it's going to do first is going to go ahead and execute this function, and its return statement is going to be what is passed to as an argument to the print statement. And that's one example of passing arguments as passing function as arguments to another function. Just to demonstrate this to you even more clearly, I'm just going to go ahead and build our own function. This function is going to be called def. You're going to say find underscore total, and find total is going to take add, which is going to be our function. It's going to take num1 and num2. Okay, so it's always good to use typing. So I'm going to say float, and also here you're going to go is of type float, just like that. So once we have this done, I'm just going to go in here and just go ahead and call so I'm going to go ahead and simply say print add. You're calling the add function, passing num1, right, and num2. That's basically it. So what does this function really do? So let me just explain to you what this function does. So this function, whenever you call this function, it expects us to pass in add, which is going to be another Python function. Basically, you're passing a function as arguments to another function, right? So that's it. So let's go ahead and call this function right here. So I'm going to say find total, and you're going to go ahead and pass in our addition function, which we define up here. It's called add. You're going to pass in num1 is going to be 20, num2 is going to be 30.8, right? So good. So once we have this, let me just comment this out so you don't get any other print statement. I just want to check this specific print statement. And if I go ahead and run the code again, you can see we get back 50.8. And how is this being done? So you're passing in the addition function as an argument to another function, right? And you're passing along with it, you're passing two numbers. So it's going to take taking the addition function and call it within that specific function and passing those two numbers, which is addition one and number one and number two. Basically, we're doing this thing right here, but now in form of another function, and the function is passed as an argument to that function. So that's basically it. So that's the first part when you say that a Python function is a first class object in Python. So another thing to prove that Python function are first class objects is let's say that you can pass functions to variables. So let's say pass functions to variables in Python. So we have that also. So that's another way to prove that a function is a first class object, is that we can store a function in another variable. So I'm going to say variable underscore function is going to be addition. So now I can go ahead and say var underscore function, and I can call it, right? So I can pass in 20 and let's say 50. So that's be 70 point something. So let me just comment this out so you don't get multiple print statement. So I'm just going to run this again. We're not printing out anything because this addition function returns to us something, right? So I'm just go ahead and print out the return of this. So the return of this function. So I'm going to go ahead and print print it right here. So that's basically another way of saying that you're passing function as arguments to another function, right? So you're passing this function call as arguments to the print function, because the print function, as I said, is an inbuilt function in Python. So if I run again, you get 70, right? Yeah, because 20 plus 50 is 70. So we get back that statement right there. So good. That's how another way we can say that function can be stored in variables in Python. So you can see we have a variable called var underscore function that stores this function, which is called add, and we can call now var add function and pass in those parameters. Even though we haven't defined this as a function, it's just a variable, but since it's storing a function now, it also acts and basically behaves like a function when you can call it. So that's another way of saying that functions can be stored in variables. Another way of saying that Python functions are first class objects is that they can be stored in other data structures. So store functions in data structures. Yeah. So in Python, we have covered a couple of data structures such as list, tuples, and all of that. So I'm just going to use a list in this case to demonstrate it to you. So I'm going to have a list underscore funcs, and this is going to be equals to, I'm going to go ahead, it's going to be of type list. So I'm going to say of type list, right? And it's going to be equals to a list, and I'm going to add in our addition function, and you can say var function. So we have this also being a function, right? Because it stores a function. We also have an additional function, add function, add addition function itself. So how do we call this function? So let's just say total, is going to be equals to just going to go ahead and say list underscore function, which is going to be our list, right? So we can get the first element, which is going to be index 0. So the first element is going to be this addition function at index 0. It's going to return to us this addition function. So we can just call this function and pass in this value. So you can see you can pass in two numbers, right? Num1 and num2. I can say 40 and 70, right? So that's basically it, and I can go ahead and print out the total of those two. So I can print out the total of the two. So if I run the code again, let me just comment this out so that we don't have a duplicate print statement. So run the code, now again back 111, which is adding 70 and 40, right? So we are basically calling this function through the use of a list. So I'm saying list get me index 1, and index 1 is going to be a function. You're calling that function and passing in 40 and 70, and it's going to return to us the result. So that's really what we mean by functions are first class objects in Python. So this book on Python tricks is a really good book. So if you guys can afford to get the book, I would advise you to get the book. It's really powerful book to read on Python. So good. Okay, now let's move on to some examples of working with functions in Python. So writing a function takes into write a function that takes into numbers and returns the power of the first number raised to the second number. So this is just a practical. So I've covered the basics of function in Python. So let's just do some examples to make sure that we consolidate what you have learned so far. So I just want to say def, and it's going to be power, and you're going to take in the first number. So I'm going to say the number, and it's going to be num1. So num1 is going to be of type float, and I'm also going to take num2. And num2 so it's going to be of type integer. So I'm going to go ahead and simply say return num1 raised to num2, right? We have done this operator, right? Or we have covered that operator in Python. So if you haven't checked out the video, you can go back and check that video in on it. Okay, so once I have it, I'm going to go ahead and simply do print, and I'm going to print power, and I'm going to pass in 3 raised to 2 raised to 3. That's going to be let's see what we get. So I got an error that says power is not defined. Okay, that I got the spelling there wrong. So it's gonna be power, and okay, I think I did a typo right there. So let me just delete this part. Is power, right? So yeah, that's it. And I can run the code again. So you get 2 raised to power 3 is obviously 8. So I get back 8. Good. This is just an example of practicing with what you have learned so far, right? So good. Once we have this done, you can also do this using inbuilt functions in Python if you want. You can use the power function from the math module, and you can work with that. You have looked at the math module already, right? So you can use that if you want. But let's move on to modern Python function syntax. In modern Python, whatever we have done so far is going to work for you, right? But now in modern Python, we have a different way of doing functions. Okay, so let's look at it, and let's say modern Python function, get that right. So it's going to be function syntax, just like that. So modern Python syntax, functions in modern Python have a different way of doing things, but it's basically just the same concept. And you can choose to use the old way, whatever I've taught you so far, or you can choose to use the modern Python syntax. So the modern Python syntax has this kind of stuff. So just type it out, and I'll explain to you what each of this means. So I'm going to go in and just say function body, and it's going to be function return statement if this is going to be optional. Okay, that's basically the modern Python syntax way of defining. So let me just comment this out so you start getting those errors. Okay, so what does this really mean? So in modern day Python, we have the same approach. So we have the def keyword, right? And then we have the function name, parameters. You can have one or many parameters or no parameters, and then you also have the return statement. So the return statement is what this function is going to return. So if I go up here, you can see if I hover on add, you can see the arrow at the end, and then arrow and then float. So it's going to tell me that this function is going to return to me float after whenever I call it when passing those two values, because if you're taking in two floats values, and if you do anything with floats, you get back floats, right? So that's how that function works. So you can actually go ahead and specify which data type your function is going to return, so it makes it your code more readable. And if a person gets your code that maybe is going to use it, and you didn't explain to him the code yourself, you can easily just hover on the function, and you can get a quick documentation on what the function does and what the function returns. And that's the real power of using type hints in Python, right? So a person can look at your code and quickly understand what the code does. Okay, So let me just go ahead and show you how let's go ahead and create a simple function right here. So let's go ahead and repeat the same addition function. So add function, you're going to take in number, let's say number one, let's say it's going to be of type int. I'm also going to take in number num2, and num2 is also going to be of type int. And then finally let me just say num okay, num2 is also going to be of type int. And then what this function is going to do is that you're going to have a return statement. So if you do operations with integers, you get back an integer. So we're going to say the return is going to be of type int. So we press enter, and then you say return num1 and then add it to num2. That's basically it. So now if I go ahead and call this function, and I just hover on it, you can see I get the quick documentation tab. I need to pass in num1, which is going to be of type integer. I also need to pass in num2. So let me pass in num1 is 10 and then comma. So now it's telling me to pass in num2. It's also going to be of type integer. So I'm going to pass in 2. And now it's going to return to me an integer, right? So I need to go ahead and actually print this out. So let me just comment this so we don't have multiple print statements. So I'm going to go ahead. You can store this in a variable, or you can just go ahead and print it out. So I'm just going to go ahead and print it out myself. So I'll run the code and I can get 12, right? So we get back 12. Good. Yeah, that's basically it, how these things work. So we're just taking the type, right? The parameters and their types, the parameters, their types, and then space, and then the arrow, and then finally what you're going to return after doing that. So let's say that you're going to let's say this is going to be of type float, right? So let me just change this to be of type float. So expect you to pass in an integer and a float, right? And whenever you do an operation with another thing, you should get back a float, not an integer, right? So I'm just going to go back in here and change that int to float. So we'd say float as well. So good. So if I hover now on this function, you can see now the return type is of float. So if I go ahead and pass in 20.9, and if I run the code again, we should get back 30.9, right? If I run the code, 30.9. So everything works as it should, right? So that's how modern day Python functions work, and you will be seeing this a lot of time, and especially if you're using Python libraries. When you get into web development, data science, you'll see this a lot, and so it helps you to read code and be able to understand code. You see, just by hovering over this function, I can tell what this function does. So it takes in the first argument is going to be of type integer, the second argument is going to be of type float, and it's going to return to us a float, right, which is indicated by the arrow. Okay, so right, let's just do more practice, and then we can just end this part right here. So let's say write a function, right? Let's write a function that takes in a list and returns the sum of all the numbers that are divisible by 2 within that list. So let's go ahead and actually write this function. Again, we're done with the Python. We're done with the basic functions. The Python. This is just for us to consolidate our idea. Okay, so I want you to practice more to be able to understand how these things work. So I'm going to divisibility sum. You're going to take in a nums, and num is going to be of type list. You're going to go ahead and return to a float. Okay, so a float. So once I have it, I'm going to say total equals to 0, and you can say total is going to be of type float. So we're going to go ahead and say for num in nums, right? And nums is the parameter that you're taking in, right? The nums is the parameter taking into our function. So what we're going to do, we're going to check if num is divisible by 2. So I'm going to check if num divided by 2, if the result is 0, means that number is divisible by 2, right? So we have covered the modulus operator, which returns you the remainder. So you're going to take num divided by 2, and we're going to get the remainder. That's what the modulus operator does, this operator right here. So once we do that, if the remainder is 0, means the number is absolutely divisible by 2. So we're going to say total, we're going to add it to our total plus equals to num, right? Else we can just say else we can have continue. So what continue simply does is says go on to the next the next number instead of our list. Go back to the next iteration of the for loop. So that's what continuous does. And also the break, which simply jumps out of the loop, and I've explained to you that in the some of the previous tutorials. So continue simply just says go on to the next number in the loop, right? So at the end, you're going to go ahead and return the total. Yeah, good. So once you have that function, you can go ahead and print the result of divisibility by sum, and you can pass in a list, right? Basically a number. So 2, 5, 4, 6, and 7. So now if I go ahead and run the code, we should get back 12, right? And that's what you get. So it's going to take 2 because 2 is divisible by 2. It's going to take 4 because 4 is divisible by 2. And so it's going to take 6 because 6 is divisible by 2. So 10 plus 4, it is 10. 4 plus 6, which is 10, plus 2, it is 12. And that's how we're getting 12 back here. Good. So yeah, that's basically it, how you can practice with stuff like that in Python. So now let's look at how you can work with more complicated stuff in Python. So let's say that you're returning multiple types in Python, and how do you specify using typing? So you can return more than just one stuff. So instead of here just returning the total, you can return multiple things from a function. So let's look at how you can return multiple things in Python. So for example, I'm going to show how to do this with type hints. Again, you can modify it and work with the older versions of Python. Okay, it's still going to work as usual. So I'm just going to have a function called multiple returns. So multiple underscore returns, and multiple returns takes in num1, and num1 is going to be of type integer, num2 is going to be of type integer, and then finally we're going to go ahead have a return statement, and the return statement is going to return a tuple, right? Basically it's going to return to us num1 and num2. So for now, let me just forget about this tuple, the return statement, and I'm just going to go ahead and simply return num1 comma num2, just like that. So once I have this, I can go ahead and call this function right here. I'm going to say print multiple returns. So if I go ahead and let me just comment this out, so we don't have multiple print statements. So I'm going to comment this out. So I'm going to go in VS Code and run the code again. Now you can see we get back this right here. We're not calling that function, right? You're just passing in the name of the function, which is going to return to us some memory address, right? So actually we need to call this function by calling the function to pass in the opening and closing parameters at the end. So if I run the code again, you're going to get an error because this expects us to pass in two things. So let me just pass in 20 and 50. So if I go ahead and run the code, now you get back 20 and 50 in form of a tuple. So you can see this right here is a tuple, right? We covered tuples in the upcoming the last videos already. So that's a tuple. So that's basically what the function returns. So how do you specify this in type hint? So let's go ahead and say from typing import this tuple, right? So I'm going to go down here and simply say it's going to be of type tuple. So return, and it's going to be tuple, and this tuple is going to be a tuple of what? It's going to be a tuple of integer and integer, right? Two integers, because you're taking two integers right here. You're going to return two integers because you're returning these two values, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and run the code again. Now you can see we get back two integers. So that's another way you can do it. So if I hover on this, now you can see I get a clear documentation of the function. So the function takes in an integer, two integers, right? num1 and num2, and simply returns a tuple consisting of two integers, num1 and num2. So that's how you can pass in how you can specify the multiple returns with type hints in Python. Yeah, so another way you can do this thing, another way is that you can also have you can return an optional, and you can also have optional stuff. Let's say that let me just write another function out for you guys. I'm just going to have another def function, and this is just for type hints in Python. Okay, so we have done with basically the tuples, the basic of functions in Python. This is just some additional stuff about type hints in Python. Okay, so dealing with modern day Python. So I'm going to have type 1 is going to be of type any. So we also have the any type, and any type basically what it simply does is that it can be of any type. Basically it can be a number, it can be a float, it can be an integer, it can be a list, it can be a tuple, it can be a set, it can be just any data type in Python. Then that's what the any is for. So I can say number 1 is going to be of type any, right? It can be anything, and num2 can be of type can also use any, right? So any. So what are going to be the return statement of this? Let me just go ahead down here and write the return. So return num1 comma num2. So num2, just like that. So we're going to return num1 and num2, and I'm going to go ahead and write an arrow function right here. So this arrow function is going to be integer, pipe symbol, and then float. What this simply does is that it's either going to return an integer or a float. So imagine that I call this function and pass in either a number, right? Any number. So I don't know what number to expect. So I'm going to say that this function might either, because I said the number might either be of any type, right? It can either be an integer, a float, or anything, right? So I don't know what to return. So I'm just saying the return statement is going to be either an integer or a float, or simply that's one way of doing it. Or you can simply just go ahead and say return type is going to be any, right? Basically anything. But if you want to directly specify what you expect that it might be, you can use the pipe symbol to separate those things. So let's say that you expect to be a list, then you can just go ahead here and simply pass in a list. You can say list, right? So either a list or a float means that this function, whenever it's called, is going to return to you either a list or a float, right? So that's the type hints in Python. Again, I'll make a whole video on type hints in Python so that you can practice more, but for now these are just the basics of type hints with functions in Python. So this is the end of this tutorial on functions in Python using type hints as well. So I hope you guys have a clear understanding of how these functions work. Again, don't stress yourself too much with the type hints. You can always come back and learn the type hints later on. Just for now, just focus on understanding what a function is and how it can be used for different stuff in your program, like writing reusable code that you can call whenever you need it, right? And not code that is always being executed unless it's called. So that's basically the idea that I want you to take away from this part. The type hints are just modern Python syntax, and you can learn them as you go along. Okay. But this is just to give you a basic foundation of type hints. Type hints with functions in Python, so that if you do start working with other frameworks in Python and you come across this, you don't get like completely thrown off. Yeah, so that's basically it for this video. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. In the next one, we'll be looking at arguments in functions. Okay.